1947 would have had a very different history if you'd had, say, 100,000 Brits with farms. They didn't want to leave.
A commercial company enslaved a nation comprising 200 million people. That kind of shocks you to the core.
England is only producing 7%, even some calculations, even 4% of the world's GDP at the time.
India's around 30% around that time.
Because we all know about the British Empire, we assume the East India Company is this great swaggering thing. Actually, as you say, it's a startup.
Then somewhere along the way, they also inherit Bombay as a dowry.
They don't even plan that, exactly. There are descriptions from Brits who were there watching it of bodies bobbing in the Ganges, piles of corpses in the streets of Calcutta and Murshidabad. Do you know how many Brits are killed in 1947? 7. 1.5 million Indians die in partition. This unlikely alliance forms between, on one hand, red-coated, beef-eating Brits of the 18th century, and on the other hand, these sort of wiry, white cotton-wearing, Marwari vegetarian Jains.
The trademark East India Company is owned by, say, 2 brothers from Kerala who sell pickle or something, so it's probably...
No, it's very grand. No, it's better than pickle. It's sort of fancy chocolates and super expensive teas. In India, people have come to think of the Mughals mainly in terms of sort of Hrithik Roshan and Aishwarya Rai sitting, dropping mangoes into each other's mouths while pigeons flutter in the background.
William, welcome back.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be back.
Yeah, absolutely. In the last episode, we talked about this glorious period in Indian history spanning over 1500 years. And right towards the end of this period, this very different phase in Indian journey starts. We have all these people coming from the west and conquering, initially small lands and eventually establishing the whole Mughal Empire. And by the time Mughal Empire is at its peak, we have all these Europeans starting to come, from different.
One important bit you missed out there, which is very important. Everyone in India obviously knows about the Islamic invasions, the Turkish invasions, and that every WhatsApp forward that's ever been often refers to that. What people forget out is, and which is really important, is the Mongol invasions of Genghis Khan, and they affect India hugely. Not because the Mongols themselves came down and devastated, because they were kept the way out, but it creates a hostile border with Central Asia, and that stops the old trade routes going north and locks India in. And it also means that there are tens of thousands of refugees from Central Asia who come down to Delhi. And this is the period when Delhi moves from being a Sanskritic, Hindvi-speaking place to a culture which is largely Persianate. And Persian remains, we often forget this, Persian remains the diplomatic language across India, even in the court of Shivaji, right up to the 18th century.
God knows, this is super interesting. So you are saying this, Islamic invasion started because it's not like people were attracted towards, they wanted to conquer India. They're fleeing from something. They wanted to be in a safer place.
So there's different things going on. So we call it, I think, usually here, the Islamic invasions. Specifically, it's a Turkish invasion. And it's a bunch of Turkish tribes who are different from the tribes that have been in Afghanistan before. And they have really mastered the art of cavalry archer warfare. And these guys come in from the 12th century onwards. There's first of all the Ghurids, Ghaznavids, and in a matter of only 200 years, they get as far south as Madras. And what is it? My personal theory is that the kind of peak of Indian brilliance and influence is the kind of 5th, 6th, 7th century, as we were talking in the last podcast. There's a decline after that. And I think that the fact that India falls so totally and so quickly is partly because India is already not moving forward, is not the center of things in the way that it had been 300 or 400 years earlier. So we often look at it as the cause of India's decline, but you can also see it as a symptom of earlier decline. And I mean, these are complicated matters, but the Mongol invasions are important because they change India as much as the Turkish invasions. And although there's one event which saves India even worse, which is when Genghis Khan gets as far as Multan, he sees a rhinoceros. And apparently believes that it's a terrible bad omen and a demon, and then turns around and instead goes off and burns Poland.
Wow.
So,
wow.
but for which we'd have lost all our pre-12th century monuments, I
All
think,
right.
in
But
half of India.
it was short-lived reprieve. I think a lot of terrible thing happened subsequently.
It's true.
But at one hand, look, the empire building and wars and these great conquests have been part of human history. As far as we have known history for like Alexander the Great, and even before that. But there's never been in the history, a corporation conquering a large land and hundreds of millions of people, and that's a fascinating history that you cover in this book, Anarchy. And I was absolutely gripped, because see, we all know broadly what happened, and we think the similar to Islamic invasion. The headline here is British rule India, but would you realize that British officially as an empire started ruling only from 1857 onwards. Before that, it was a company which was founded way back in 1600. In fact, this very first page of the book, you have this quote from Leo Tolstoy: "A commercial company enslaved a nation comprising 200 million people." That kind of shocks you to the core that how this come to happen. And I think you narrate the history brilliantly in this book. But let's start with the founding of East India Company. It was a very modest company. Started about 1600 thereabouts, and it was 150 years before there were any meaningful conquest in India. What was going on? How did East India Company build itself up to where this was even a remote possibility?
So I've written not just this one book, The Anarchy. There's a quartet of books, which chronologically, The Anarchy is the first. The second is White Mughals. The third is Return of the King. And the final one is The Last Mughal, about Maharaja Zafar and the fall of the Mughal and the end of the company. And I've now gone on and written other stuff. We talked about the Golden Road in the last episode. And the further, in a sense, those books recede behind me, the stranger this story becomes. Because as you say, it's not the British who conquer India. It's one company. Yeah. And in the year that the company is founded, which is, they put in their application 1599. It's finally passed in 1600. 1599 is the year that Shakespeare wrote Hamlet, wrote Julius Caesar. England is only producing 7%, or even some calculations, even 4% of the world's GDP at the time.
India's around 30% around that time.
30 plus, maybe 30 to 40. And I think in India, people have come to think of the Mughals mainly in terms of sort of Hrithik Roshan and Aishwarya Rai sitting, dropping mangoes into each other's mouths while pigeons flutter in the backgrounds. What they forget is that behind all that money is a massive industrial empire. Unseen behind the screens of Fatehpur Sikri lie 1 million looms in Bengal in the 18th century. India is the manufacturing capital, particularly in textiles. Absolute, unquestioned master of world textile trade. And it is the richest period of Indian history since the period we talked about at the Golden Road, when India had a different sort of mercantile power going in both directions. But India, between 30 and 40% of world GDP. The economic figures are very unreliable for earlier periods of history. And it's one of the periods, along with the Gupta era, really, when India is ahead of China, which only happens 2 or 3 times in history, when India is producing more than China and more dominant. And yet, it's not just Britain. It's one company based in one building, 6 windows wide. I mean, it's like, a small bungalow in central Delhi, not we're sitting in some fancy hotel in Bangalore. It's a fraction of the size.
A startup in 1600.
Yeah, it's a startup. It's literally a startup. And even 150 years later, when the conquest begins, at the time of Plassey, do you know how many white guys there are in India? 250.
Incredible.
250. And so what they're doing is fighting.
That's worth repeating. The first major conquest that happens in 1757.
Yeah.
Only 250 white people are in the country.
Only 250 white guys. And so the people doing the fighting are not Brits. They're not Brits at all. They are sepoys, which are basically Indian trained mercenaries. And who is paying for the conquest?
Maybe before you get into that, a little bit, let's cover a bit of that 150-year period. How did they landed up in India? There is a very interesting story you tell about, these guys going to the court of Jahangir and trying to get permission about, trading in India. And this guy is not interested. He think, tell me about your art and culture and what do you do. And these guys
and particularly Big Jahangir, how do you make beer?
How do you make beer? Yeah, very important, obviously. Yeah.
So yes, so we often, I think, we always see the past through the prism of the present. Because we all know about the British Empire, we assume the East India Company is this great swaggering thing. Actually, it's as you say, it's a startup. It's a bunch of guys in an office. There's a guy called Sir Thomas Smythe, who is the sort of, I don't know, Vijay Mallya, if you like, of Elizabethan England. He's got a little beard. He's got a little top hat. And he comes up with this idea specifically as a poke in the eye to the Dutch. Because the Dutch have pioneered this route. It wasn't the British who thought about this first. The Dutch have already gone as far as, and the East India Company is initially aimed not at India, it's initially aimed at what we would call Indonesia. And even the furthest bit of Indonesia near Papua New Guinea. Near that area, there's the Banda Islands. One of those islands is called the island of Run. It's about, tiny little island, but it produces all the world's nutmeg. And the Dutch sail all the way there, buy the nutmeg, sail all the way back, sell it for a fortune. Because previously, all these spices had been passed from Indonesia to India, India to Egypt, Egypt to Venice, from Venice to Northern Europe. And at each stage, there's a markup. So that by the time it reaches Northern Europe, people are paying a fortune for a tiny bit of nutmeg or chili, nutmeg or pepper or cinnamon. And so what the Dutch do, they make a fortune, and this reaches the eyes of the English. And then the Dutch come to London and ask about buying some English shipping. And this is too much for the nationalistic English at the time. And they say, you can't come and buy our ships just to make more money. We can do this ourselves. And there's one guy in England that's already done this voyage, but he sank his ship on the way back. He's not the obvious choice of captain. Anyway, he's the only person that knows the way, so they employ him. Initially, they have a public subscription. They have a meeting on the 15th of September, 1599, the same month that Shakespeare is finishing Hamlet. So you can imagine that if Shakespeare got stuck in the middle of, to be and not to be, how do I finish this speech? He goes for a walk. In 20 minutes, he can be in the hall in Blackfriars, where the East India Company was founded. And they have this meeting. As with the modern startup, people put forward money, they invest a certain sum. We have the original accounts for that first meeting as people volunteer.
And one of the very first joint stock company in the world.
Yeah. This is the brilliant Tudor invention. There are various disputes about this academically, but you can basically say it's an invention of the Elizabethan English. The idea that you have a company and that investors can put money in and get a share of the money out. And the first one is called the Muscovy Company, which trains with Moscow. It's 1550. So East India Company is 50 years after that. It's not the first, but it's one of the first. And it has this meeting. It buys with the profit, with the capital it's raised, a ship. It's a pirate ship. So think Johnny Depp and Pirates of the Caribbean. It's called the Scourge of Malice. I'm not making this up. It's literally the name of the ship. And they realize this is not good for business. So they changed the name of the ship to the Red Dragon, which they make it sound like a pub in Wales or something. And they sail off. Initially, they get stuck because there's no wind. And this boat bobs around the channel and people come and wave at it and think these guys are never going to get anywhere.
Embarrassing start.
Embarrassing start. But the wind picks up. Off they go. And they don't even have to go all the way to Run because just as they're approaching Run, a Portuguese ship is coming out. And as these are literally a bunch of pirates, they just land on the Portuguese ship, transfer the contents to their ship and sail home.
That's an easy way of doing business.
Easy way of doing business. And they arrive in London in 1601, I think, and they sell this for £1 million. It's a massive success.
The character was already built.
Already built. You take someone else's stuff, you sell it for a profit, and everyone's happy. And pretty soon they buy this property in Leadenhall Street, which becomes the base of the East India Company for the rest of its career. And this building grows from a tiny thing like a pub to a slightly bigger Georgian building, which is what it is at the time of Plassey, 6 windows wide, till eventually by 1857, when it's finally dismantled, It's the size of Buckingham Palace. It's spread up the street and taken over half of Leadenhall. It's now underneath. I don't know whether your listeners will know the Lloyd's building in London, in the city of London. It's one of the big prominent buildings.
They probably don't advertise much that it was the
They don't. There's no blue plaque. There's nothing to commemorate one of the most important sites in British history. Anyway, so these guys initially are the new kids on the block. The Mughals don't take them seriously. The Portuguese have told the Mughals that the Brits are some sort of, savages from the outer hemisphere. And it takes them 50, 60 years to really get established. Initially, even, they're not even focused on it. They're focused on Indonesia.
Yeah.
But the Dutch kick them out of Indonesia. And there's a face-saving treaty when, having been basically defeated by the Dutch, they hand over the English islands that they've taken over in Indonesia to the Dutch, and they get in return as a face-saving compensation prize a muddy island in the Hudson River called Manhattan. So that's how Manhattan comes to the Brits. Turns out to be not a bad investment in the long run. But they then begin trading with India in the 1640s, focusing on India. They forget the spice trade. And this turns out to be their brilliant. It wasn't, it was forced on them. It wasn't their sort of initiative to focus on the textiles in India.
Yeah, again, parallel to a lot of startups, a lot of pivots are forced on you and it turns out to be work out well.
And this is exactly it. They pivot from textiles in Indonesia. They pivot from spices in Indonesia to textiles in India. And particularly by the early 18th century, the east coast of India, their biggest base becomes Calcutta. They found this city, which some say was founded originally by the Armenians, but there's a whole chain of different settlements along the Hooghly, because also the French are there, the Dutch are there, the Portuguese are there. And they make a success of it. And by the 18th century, when the Mughal Empire is breaking up, the Brits are in pole position. And there is a whole world, which we've, I think, largely forgotten, of conflicts between the English and the French in the early 18th century. And with a slightly different shake of the dice, it could have been the French that got it.
And, so during these 150 years, they finally, in the pivot to India, the textile business starts to do well. They're building, this weird establishment. And somewhere along the way, they also inherit Bombay as a dowry.
They don't even plan that. Exactly. There's a diplomatic marriage. Charles II marries Catherine of Braganza. And she comes with two cities as her dowry. One is Tangier, which is obviously North Africa. The other is a place they've never heard of called Bombay. In the original treaty, it's spelled B-U-M-B-Y-E, which doesn't sound very alluring. And the map, which was attached to the treaty, doesn't arrive in London. So they all speculate, where is Bombay? Is it in South America? Anyway, they eventually work out where it is. And initially, then even the Portuguese on the ground refuse to hand it over. They can't believe that their government has been so stupid as to give away this wonderful harbour. But after 3 or 4 years of negotiation, finally the Brits move in.
As it turns out, one of the biggest natural harbours anywhere in the world, right?
And the only harbour on the west coast where you can build a dry dock large enough to service a whole fleet.
Right.
So when the monsoon winds come, when ships are in danger, you can haul them up, you can surface them, change the timbers.
So in some ways, luck was also conspiring for them.
Huge stroke of luck. And this whole thing of pivoting to textiles in India was only because the Dutch kicked them out of the East Indies. And this was very much second choice. But it turns out, of course, 1640 is the same date as the Taj Mahal. Mughals are designing these brilliant textiles. Anyone who's listening to this in London can go and see the Mughal exhibition in the V&A at the moment. And these unbelievably beautiful textiles that were produced, that's what they were buying. But they were also buying very simple cotton cloth. And India, as well as making the fancy kalamkaris, the embroideries, all the really fancy stuff you see in museums, just made the best, highest quality, simple, what they call piece goods, which just means simple cotton cloth. And just to finish that, by the mid-18th century, there is de-industrialization in Mexico because of the massive import of simple Indian cotton cloth that the East India Company is selling on to Mexico.
Right.
So this is world-beating technology that the Indians have. They got the best weavers, particularly in Bengal. And the company, because the Mughals are from Central Asia, because the Mughals are basically former nomads, they don't have a navy.
Yeah.
They're not sea people.
Mm.
And the East India Company, probably from London, steps in as the shipper for Indian goods at the height of the Mughal Empire. So Mughal goods don't get exported by the Mughals for profit for India. They get exported by the East India Company for profit.
So somewhere they never really realized despite 2,000 a year of this thriving sea trade to Rome and so on, around this time it was mostly a forgotten
Exactly.
art.
What happens by the end of the 18th century is that Indian shippers continue to dominate the local trade. So you have ships coming out from Madras to Bombay and around the coast, and lots of Gujarat, even to East Africa. So there's a big Indian community in what's now Tanzania and so on. But it's the East India Company which has got its tentacles all over the big international shipments of massive quantities of textiles to India.
Right.
And increasingly by the end of the 18th century, also the tea trade in from China. They buy tea from the same time as Catherine Braganza gives Bombay to the English. She brings the fashion for tea drinking, which the Portuguese have brought with them not from India, but from Macau.
Got it. Yeah. So, in this book, nearly, I think, 500 plus pages, you covered that 50-year, critical period where the East India Company goes from just being a very successful trading outfit to start, conquering a lot of land, having a lot of political influence and so on. And that's it's too good to be true type of story that in a matter of 50-year period. And
in many ways, too bad to be true.
And what is shocking for me is every step of the way, Britishers are fighting with somebody from within India. It's not, they're almost getting involved in East India Company because of, they had some resources. Someone else is soliciting them, lending them money, giving their army, letting them recruit people because, that guy is my enemy. I want to get even with that. So you please come help me. And this is, every single, major war, we'll talk about some of those as we progress, but it's just shocking. In some ways, it was, the Mughal Empire was in decline. There's a lot of, I guess that's why you call the book Anarchy. There were just so many, tiny, little kingdoms, and they all had petty squabbles with somebody, nearby or within the same court.
So there's a crucial event that changes everything, in my view, is 1739, when Nadir Shah comes down. From the time of Aurangzeb's reign, there have been the Marathas coming and pricking the Mughals, capturing Surat, fights here and there. Also the Sikhs and the Punjab, the Jats in the Doab. And so there's a huge amount of unrest. And everyone's wondering who's going to be the one that catches the great mango of Delhi and gets to loot this amazing treasury the Mughals built up.
Over the last 200 years, they've amassed this probably the treasure. That's
amazing treasure. Is it going to be the Marathas? Is it going to be the Jats? Is it going to be the Sikhs? It could have been any of those. In the end, it's none. Because a complete, out of nowhere comes this Persian, Nadir Shah, who doesn't want to take over India. He just needs money to fight the Ottomans and the Russians. And he realizes that Muhammad Shah Rangila is this very weak ruler. He takes initially a raid in Afghanistan, which is under Mughal rule.
Why is he called Rangila?
Because he kind of likes wearing women's clothing and dressing very colorfully. And he's a sort of I rather like Muhammad Shah Rangila. He's a great patron of the arts. We probably wouldn't have the sitar in high Hindustani music, nor the tabla. I mean, two basic things he introduces. But he's not you wouldn't want him to lead you in war. He's not a general. And so Nadir Shah comes and he just takes everything. The whole 200 years of Mughal loot, everything the Mughals have taken from elsewhere in India, is just carted off, bag and baggage, in a single raid, 1739, off to Afghanistan and Persia.
The Peacock Throne, the
Not
Kohinoor.
just the Peacock Throne, and the Kohinoor's attached to the Peacock Throne at this point. But also 3 other thrones. I think it's something like 500 wagons full of jewels. And if you go, for example, to the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul today, the greatest treasures there are not things made by the Ottomans. They're just the tiny bit of the loot from Delhi that Nadir Shah, to irritate the Ottomans, sent as a present to show, look what I've got. And he sent another package to the Russians, and that's in the Hermitage, which is the other place you can see the best Mughal stuff. Because there's nothing here left here. It's all gone. A little bit in Hyderabad, but basically it's gone from here, and you have to go to the Hermitage and to Tehran. Still, it's all there.
So he
And
sucked
Istanbul.
Delhi dry, and it also was pretty bloody. I think it was the siege of Delhi, I guess. No, it's just very brutal.
So he sucks Delhi dry. And that is the thing that, imagine you've got a kind of big mirror. We're in a fancy hotel here on the 5th floor. Imagine we just take this mirror or this television, throw it out the window.
Yeah.
It smashes on the ground. That's what happens to the Mughal Empire. Overnight, there's no one can pay the generals, no one can pay the armies, no one can pay the civil servants. The whole thing shatters.
Yeah.
So where you'd had, for better or worse, whether you like the idea of the Mughal Empire or regard it as a foreign invasion that raped and pillaged, however you look on it, it was a united, well-organized, well-run mega state that ran everything from Balkh in Afghanistan down to Golconda in now Andhra Pradesh. And that overnight disappears into 1,000 pieces. Jaipur, Jodhpur, Udaipur, Tanjore, Hyderabad, all these little states. And who is going to mop up? Is it going to be the Marathas who get to clear up this mess?
Yeah.
Everyone, it should have been the Marathas. It could have been Tipu Sultan. It could have been all sorts of powers. But bizarrely, it's the two trading companies that become more and more powerful. There's the French Compagnie des Indes in Pondicherry, and there's the Brits based in Calcutta. And the reason that these guys are such players is there's been a technological revolution in Europe, and a new form of warfare has been invented by Frederick the Great of Prussia, who's one of the great genius generals of history. Frederick the Great invents this way of fighting, not with cavalry, which had been the big, most prestigious, everyone wants to be a cavalry officer. But no, he just recruits peasants, gives them muskets, and develops this thing called file firing, where one lot fire while the other lot are loading, and then the others sit down and fire, and the first lot load. And these little slugs from 18th century muskets are like dum-dum bullets. They hit the target and they flatten out and create carnage. A horrible, horrible weapon to receive in your face. And there's also, he invents very clever games with horse artillery. So you move your guns quickly around the battlefield and you surprise the enemy, you surround the cavalry, you do all sorts of stuff. So this new form of warfare is brought into India. And they realize very quickly that it's not rocket science, that you can train up any Indian peasant. A guy who's just been moving through his fields with his bullock carts, plowing the fields, can easily work a musket and learn how to load it. And they train up these small Sipai armies. The first time this becomes clear is when the French take on the Nawab of the Carnatic outside Chennai, Madras, in 1740, I think, 1741, just after Nadir Shah. And an army of 200 or 300 Tamils trained by the French, given this weapon, see off 10,000 cavalry. Never happened before in Indian history. And the Brits then take that forward. They defeat the French. And they have a window of about 50 years before Indian armies adopt this technology. Because it leaks out, because Indian deserters from the French and the British armies go out. They help train the Marathas and Tipu. And by the end of the 18th century, both the Marathas and Tipu Sultan have taken this technology and mastered it. And it's far, far more difficult by the end of the 18th century for either of these major powers to take on Indian armies. But in that window between about 1740 and 1800, this corporation, still based in one office in London, still with only 250 Brits in India, using, and this is one of the crucial things, the credit of the Marwari and the Jain bankers who come to Calcutta, were given tax-free status by the East India Company very cleverly. They say, you don't have to pay any taxes, just come here and lend us money. And these guys get treated far better by the East India Company than the Marathas, for example, are used to just summoning the bankers in. And if they don't lend money, they hang them upside down and wallop them. So who would you lend money to? And this is the clever thing. Although the East India Company may rape, loot, pillage, break contracts, do a million things. They always repay the bankers on time with interest.
These guys, the whole culture, Jagat Seths, right? Which is something,
the Jagat Seths are crucial to the story, the beginning of the story at least. And they are like the Rothschilds of India. They have worked out a hundi system, credit system, whereby, so in the old days of Shah Jahan, if you were the governor of Bengal, you'd gather your taxes, you'd put them all onto bullock carts, and you'd march 100 bullock carts full of gold from Hooghly up to Delhi. But by the 18th century, you can't do that because there's a million dakus and every sort of army in the way. So the Jagat Seths are clever, and they say, don't worry, sir, just pay it into our office in Hooghly and you can withdraw it in Delhi and we'll take 10%. And the Mughals calculate that this is a far better deal than risking the roads of India in the 18th century. And so year after year, the Jagat Seths are getting 10% of the entire Mughal tax budget.
And these were many families?
This was a network of Jain moneylenders. They'd been just 2 generations out of Jodhpur. Most of these Mawari families still have their ancestral havelis out in the desert beyond Bikaner and Jodhpur and Jaipur. And these guys are welcome to Calcutta. Calcutta, in the same way that today, if you go to Dubai and you're a rich businessman, you end up paying almost no tax. This is what the East India Company did for the Mawari. So they're happy to come to Calcutta. And they say, how much would you like to borrow, sir? Can I offer you this rate of interest?
And then there's a big stroke of luck comes in 57. So Bengal was one of the richest provinces in India, like the big source of big source of revenue for Mughal Empire. Now you have this young king there, Sirajud-Dowlah, who is not liked by anyone. It could be somebody else, but this guy, everyone nearly hated him. And then, I think Mir Jafar from his court reaches out to British to help her.
Not Mir Jafar. Mir Jafar is only the front man for the Jagat Seths. It's the Jagat Seths.
Jagat Seths.
And the Jagat Seths, incidentally, had originally placed Siraj-ud-Dowlah's grandfather, Ali Verdi Khan, on the throne. And now they realize that they've got some young psycho. Like it's the sort of Uday Hussain character, the guy that used to shoot the Baghdad football team if they didn't get a goal. This guy. So Siraj-ud-Dowlah is like that, randomly like sinking boats in the Ganges and watching people drown. He's a complete psycho. And then he makes the mistake of threatening the Jagat Seths. And the Jagat Seths are try to leave town. They go off on pilgrimage to some Jain, and they're brought back, they're manhandled, and they say, right, enough. So they reach out to the East India Company, who they've been doing business with very successfully for I don't know how many hundreds of years, 100. And this unlikely alliance forms between, on one hand, red-coated, beef-eating Brits of the 18th century, and on the other hand, these sort of wiry, white cotton-wearing, Mawari vegetarian Jains. But these two find common cause and realize that Siraj-ud-Dowlah is bad for both their business, and that if they form an alliance together...
And before we progress any further, I think it's worth emphasizing, we are talking about just 1757, and till that point, there was no overt ambition on the part of British to want to conquer land here, build big armies and so on. They kind of get sucked into this because of internal strife and discontent among just various people here, who are in varied, misaligned interests.
So the first hint you get of this is in the letters of the guy who leads the British in 1757, who's called Robert Clive. And Robert Clive is the kind of Mark Zuckerberg of the East India Company. He's this brilliant guy, not very popular, not liked, but has this sort of weird ability to size out the weaknesses of his opponents. And he was a sort of ruffian at school. He was a thug. And he gets sent into the East India Company because his family can't get him a job. And he arrives, he's sort of slightly unbalanced. He tries to shoot himself in his first years. He hates India, doesn't like Indians, shows no interest in India at all. And yet he is an unorthodox mind. And at one point he is recruited to fight the French, he realizes he has a talent not for accountancy, but for fighting. And he breaks all the rules. 18th century warfare is a bit like a chess game. It's a formal, there's rules. Clive throws the board aside. He attacks in the rear at night in a thunderstorm. He terrifies his opponents. When he's attacking Sirajuddaula outside Calcutta, he gets up at 3 a.m, sends his troops in boats to the rear of the Mughal lines and comes in through the mist. And this sort of tactics is not what they do in the 18th
And this
century.
was, from what I understand, the Sirajuddaula by the time had amassed an army of 50,000 people, and this guy had a few hundred.
Oh, Sirajuddaula's army was even larger, I think. And it's a tiny army, and he is also not at all clear that the Jagat Set's not going to betray him. He's worried he's been lured into a trap. They don't answer his letters for a few days, and he's about to turn back, but he just gambles on it and moves forward to Plassey. He's surrounded, and what saves him, because there's no sign at all that Mir Jafar, who's meant to join his side and help the Brits are being massacred, and Mir Jafar's doing nothing to honor the agreement. And then the stroke of fortune that changes the history of India, the monsoon breaks out. The massive downpour. And the Brits have bought tarpaulins and the Mughals haven't. So when the monsoon flood ends and the sky clears like it does do, mid-afternoon, suddenly the skies are bright blue. The British have got dry powder, and the Mughals assume that the Brits haven't done this. So they lead a major cavalry charge, and they're met with this blazing wall of cannon. And then the army just runs away. Mir Jafar finally honors his thing, walks his army off. And 2 days later, Sirajuddaula is caught, killed. His body is paraded. Clive marches in to the treasury in Murshidabad, fills his pockets with jewels, and then punts 7 punts full of jewels and gold down to Fort William. Because what the Jagat Sets have offered him an unbeatable offer. They say, if you take on Sirajuddaula, we will give you £1 million personally, Robert Clive, £1 million to the East India Company. And so he becomes overnight the richest man in Europe, the richest self-made man in Europe.
In just 2 days, Jagat Seth's conspiring with him, lending him money, big promises. Mir Jafar in the end betraying, not really doing his bit in the particular war. This guy Sirajuddaula being absolutely competent, hated guy, and this very timely monsoon. If none of this
history could have been totally different.
Totally different, And from there on, Clive becomes a pretty famous man and wealthy, famous.
So Clive, at the time when he helps himself to the jewels, later he's hauled before Parliament to ask him, who gave you permission to do this? You were meant to fight the French. That's why he went to Bengal. And he answers, my lords, the bankers were on their knees before me. Their coffers were thrown open to me. My lords, I am astonished at my own moderation. And everyone laughs in Parliament and he gets off. Later, he's hated by the British public, interestingly. And he's booed in the streets and hissed because he has his reputation as this,
Lord Vulture.
Yeah, he's called Lord Vulture. There's a play and he's called Lord Vulture.
So eventually he shoots himself.
So he shoots himself, commits suicide.
Yeah, sure.
Which is the just desert.
But what happens after 57? So it's suddenly like
he doesn't shoot himself. Even worse, that he cuts his veins with a paper knife. A terrible death, bleeding to death.
Not too old. Also, must have had a pretty yes, you said maybe a slightly off strange inner life.
He was. I think we'd probably call him a manic depressive today, and like many manic depressives, sort of genius, dark genius. Right. And he's a fascinating character. He's my Lord Voldemort, if you like. He's this sort of dark lord who, for all his malignancy, calls it right time after time after time.
And then after Plassey, I think in the book you talk about in some ways, not less known, but even more decisive battle was the Buxar. And again, a lot of luck plays a huge role in that.
So nearly lost. So Buxar. So what happens? 1757, Battle of Plassey, the British seize Bengal. It's the richest province. And that becomes the engine for everything that follows. So the British so plunder Bengal immediately after Plassey that the puppet Nawab they've put in, Mir Qasim, rises up against them. And he forges an alliance not only with Shuja-ud-Dawla of Awadh, but the
Mhm.
Mughal Emperor,
Mhm.
Shah Alam. So 3 Mughal armies come together.
Yeah.
And they so nearly defeat the British. In fact, they think they've won.
Yeah.
And what happens is that Shuja-ud-Dawla calls it a victory and sort of starts partying. And all the Mughals try and plunder the British baggage train, abandon the front line. And the Brits are trying to evacuate. And they've arranged, the plan was that if things went wrong, they had these barges and they were
Mhm.
going to withdraw by boat.
Yeah.
But the barges don't turn up.
Mhm.
So they're forced to stay here. And rather than be killed, of course, what you do with your backs against the river, you have no option. They fight on. And the major Indian victory turns to a defeat because they abandon the line.
It's incredible. So in some ways, war was this particular battle was already over. The Indians, were celebrating.
Exactly.
And British was trying to flee. And literally there's no bridge to cross. So they see this opportunity that, maybe there is a little bit of letting down of the guard.
Yeah.
And they attack back and somehow end up winning the battle.
Exactly that. I mean, it's that narrower. So both Plassey and Buxar, certainly not fait accompli. They're, slightly different shake of the hand of fate. And they could.
And now with Buxar, even the Shah Alam, the Mughal Emperor, becomes their vassal state.
They capture Shah Alam. Shah Alam is now their fig leaf. What the East India Company doesn't advertise in later years is that they declare themselves the slave of Shah Alam, and they use this nominal.
Yeah.
The protectors of Shah Alam is what they pretend to be. And what's clever about the East India Company is that they realize that their power is their seaports. So they use the resources of Awadh and Bengal, which are the most rich and fertile states of India at that time, to build up the most colossal mercenary army.
And these sepoys are nearly, I'm getting 95%, 99% Indian?
95%. Yeah. And so these guys, and they, like the Romans, they're clever enough to make you fight not at home, but so South Indian sepoys fight in the north, North Indian sepoys fight in the south. So you're not in home territory fighting your cousins. And it works bizarrely.
So it's the best paid job available to. I'm guessing a lot of armies are being dismantled, so a lot of people are out of job. And this is a well-paying job. They probably pay on time.
And they pay on time, and they pay nearly double what Tipu Sultan pays for the Marathas. So they get the strongest, they get the best.
Yeah.
And this is a period when it's every man for himself. There's no sense of national identity. Yeah. There is a sense that the East India Company are foreigners, but it's not strong enough sense of identity to bind people together and loyalty to the Mongols or to any other forces.
Yeah.
And by 1799, the East India Company has an army of 200,000 mercenary troops at a time when the British Army, the main British Army in England, is 100,000 troops.
Wow.
So you have a corporation still based out of an office, which controls an army double the size of the state. So imagine if Ambani had an army twice the size of the Indian army. That's the equivalent.
You should not put these ideas out in there. You never know. But
or even worse, they tell Elon Musk.
Yeah. That's probably happening as we speak. So that's well on its way. But this
Elon Musk is the General Dyer. I think if Clive is the Mark Zuckerberg,
right.
I think we can say Elon Musk is the General Dyer.
Someone needs to be Trump also. Then to find the equivalent character. So what you're saying by 1799, this is probably the largest army in the world.
Largest modern army.
Largest modern army controlled by a corporation which is listed on the stock exchange. There's, share price goes up, down. They give dividends.
The extraordinary thing is that we think of, the stock exchange, share prices as being something totally modern.
Yeah.
It's going strong by the stage. And when the East India Company is defeated, the share price goes down. The East India Company win Plassey.
Yeah.
And then there's this extraordinary moment, which is again very modern. And we think this is, something of our own time. When Clive goes back after Plassey, tries to become an MP, and is sent out a second time because he hasn't made quite enough money to make small, happens to arrive in Chennai, off the coast of Madras, when the news ship arrives with news of the Battle of Plassey. Sorry, when the
Buxar.
news ship arrives with the news of the British victory at the Battle of Buxar, Clive stops the letter and sends in advance a letter to his agent in London saying, sell all my property, sell everything, and buy shares of the East India Company.
Wow.
It's classic case of insider trading.
Yeah. Wow, incredible.
And he does that. He sells all his provincial properties. He mortgages the whole of Clive. And Clive doubles or triples his holding in the East India Company, which overnight shoots up when the news of Buxar's come. Because they've defeated not just the uprisings, but Awadh and the Mughals. Yeah. And Hindustan is theirs. Yeah. There's never get it back until 1858.
Amazing. In this instance, I mean, he was not even part of the Battle of Buxar, but just being trading information, he makes
just sitting in a ship bobbing off Chennai.
Yeah. and as an act, probably one of the richest guys in Europe, at the end of it, right? Yeah.
Doubles it, triples it.
Right. And around the same time as, East India Company is getting hold of province of Bengal, and I guess an influence or even Delhi by this time. And this, great famine of Bengal happens, and which is quite a tragedy. And it's also because the East India Company had access to all the revenues of the land, but no responsibility. Like when any other government, even if it's a king or something, you are supposed to do something. You're paying tax in return for some protection, something. But here,
it's extraordinary to watch, and this changes everything because this is in the immediate aftermath of all this. And 1770, there is a drought. The Brits don't do anything, and everyone sells up their remaining seed crop and everything. By 1771, there's another drought, and now there's widespread starvation. And 1772, the rains fail a third time, and there is carnage event. Everyone in India today knows about the Second World War Bengal famine.
Yeah,
but this is possibly worse, and it's 1772. And there are descriptions from Brits who are there watching it of bodies bobbing in the Ganges, of piles of corpses in the streets of Calcutta and Murshidabad, and clouds of flies and vultures and dogs eating human beings. And this is the first time that you get whistleblowers in the East India Company, because the East India Company controls the whole narrative. There's no war correspondents here or anything sending messages back home. But individual East India Company men are so horrified by the lack of response or remorse. And some people are even speculating in grain and hoarding grain and so on to make more money in the middle of the famine. And you get this series of letters into magazines like The Spectator and The Gentleman's Magazine in London. And what's fascinating is that those British magazines then make it to America, to Boston.
Yeah.
And when, thanks to the Bengal famine, the East India Company goes bankrupt. And this is the moment when Parliament votes to buy 50% of the East India Company shares as a bailout, because the East India Company, unlike Lehman Brothers, is too big to fail. So they bail it out, and the government buys a 50% share of the East India Company. That's the moment the state, for the first time, gets involved in East India Company affairs, or in Indian affairs. And in America, you have a massive reaction because they've read about the Bengal famine. They don't want the East India Company turning up there. And so when, in a way to try and recoup the lost revenues because of the Bengal famine, the East India Company is allowed to sell their tea in America. There's a special compensation. This is what causes the Boston Tea Party.
Wow.
And you have East India Company tea thrown into Boston Harbor. And this is the beginning of the American Revolution. So these strange sort of ripples across the globe.
But another interesting connection that you talk about in the book is this guy Cornwallis, who was fighting on behalf of British in Americas, and then eventually ends up surrendering to Washington, comes back home, and they immediately send him back to India. And this time he's all determined to prove his mettle as a army commander, and ends up winning some key battles again, thanks to like this shrewd alliances with putting people, setting them against each other, and he has a series of victories here.
So it's really interesting. So he loses America. And the East India Company nonetheless recruits him because they think that he must have learned lessons from fighting the Americans. And in a sense, he has, because he makes several important changes to the law. And some of them we should be very grateful for. Because what he realizes is that the Brits are being kicked out of America, not by the Native Americans, but by the Brits who went native in America. So he begins to enact legislation to make sure that there is never a powerful settler class in Britain, that there's never a powerful settler class in India. And so he passes laws that no Brits can own property for more than, I think, 5 years.
And these are the company laws, not the...
Yeah, the East India Company. So what happens is that all Brits, for the rest of the British history in India, have to rent their properties. And there's special exceptions for things like indigo plantations and later tea plantations. But it means that basically every Brit who comes out to India goes back to England at the end of their tenure. And so you get these towns such as Tunbridge Wells and Cheltenham, into which the East India Company and the Raj officials retire. Or if they're less successful and can't afford those places, they go to Australia. And therefore, it means that in 1947, when the Raj finally comes to a close, that the Brits are able to walk out of India without barely a shot being fired at them. Do you know how many Brits are killed in 1947? 7. 1.5 million Indians die in partition, in that horrific mutual genocide partition. But the Brits get out without any casualties. Compare that to the French in Algeria. The French in Algeria bought land, settled down. The Pied Noir farmed this land, and that was their identity. That was who they were. They became settled in Algeria. So when the Algerian Civil War takes place, these guys resist. They fight bloodily. There is a massive insurgency. There is terrorism. If you ever see the Battle of Algiers, it's one of the great movies of all time. This is all laid out. And I think it's 5 million French die. Well, there's 5 million casualties in both sides in the Algerian Civil War.
I see. So what you're saying is, let's say if this legislation didn't happen and Brits were owning land and settling in here and so on, over a period of time, it would have created a deep entrenchment here.
Exactly.
Which would have made things even more complicated.
I'm not absolving the Brits at all for what they did to India. But one thing they didn't do was it never became a settler colony. You never had families passing down land generation to generation. You did have families joining the East India Company, generation to generation, mine included. But you never had what you had, say, in Ireland or in Australia or in America, which is a settler colony where they buy great chunks of land, settle it, and take it as their own. So the Brits retire. And that is a crucial difference that saved India a mass. I mean, 1947 would have had a very different history if you'd had, say, 100,000 Brits with farms. They didn't want to leave. And were defending it, like in Rhodesia, like in Northern Ireland. It's only in the end, in 1857, that we've been talking about how improbable it is that 95% of the sepoys of the British Army in India are Indians. This finally turns in 1857 when the rumor begins to spread that the East India Company is thinking of turning India into a Christian country, that they're going to be mass conversion. This was never policy. But there are a few British evangelical Christians who are bashing their Bible at their troops and reading Bible to them on parade and this sort of thing. And this is enough to make the rumor spread. And it is, having defeated Marathas, defeated Tipu Sultan, defeated the Mughals, Siraj and Dalrymple, one after another these enemies. In the end, it's their own sepoys who take them on in 1857. And it is so nearly a major victory for the sepoys. And again, there's all these things that just go wrong at the end.
But that's probably another story for a different episode.
It's the last Mughal, that one.
But I think this, just reading this book, Anarchy, William, and just going through that 50, 60 year period, what comes across is there's absolutely nothing inevitable about it without deep collaboration as well as a lot of infighting, including we didn't touch upon, Tipu Sultan, but on one hand he was trying to fight British, but he's also attacking Nizam of Hyderabad, Marathas and so on. Like they could have easily been united and could have gotten rid of the East India Company very easily.
Tipu is a fascinating character. I disagree with Vikram Sampath, who's just written a big book. Vikram depicts Tipu as this monster who hated Hindus. What is completely true is that Tipu was astonishingly violent and vile to captives, including my family. We were captive. My forebear James Dalrymple ended up in Tipu's prison after the Battle of Buxar. And there were forced conversions. There are complete horrors. But he works with Hindus in his own kingdom. And when you go to Srirangapatnam today, outside Mysore, not far from where we're sitting in Bangalore, the big temple that he patronized is still there. Go to the neighboring Hoysala temples. There are what they call Padshah lingams that he gave. So he was not vile to the Hindus in his own kingdom, but he was a brutal victor and had no mercy in victory. And in the end, that's his undoing.
I think that's something for all of us to ponder over, right?
Exactly.
And on the just on the lighter note, I think you mentioned the book that the trademark East India Company is owned by two brothers from Kerala who sell pickle or something. So it's probably
no, it's very grand. No, it's better than pickle. It's sort of fancy chocolates and super expensive tea. So.
All right, that's fitting. And William, thanks so much for taking time for this conversation as well. So much to learn from both of these books as well as earlier books. So I'll highly recommend these books to anyone who's interested in learning more about India, and hope you continue your good work with sort of like more interesting stuff. Thank you. At SparX, we aim to bring to you stories of exponential impact. We share in-depth analysis of what goes behind success stories. If you find our conversations interesting, you can join us by subscribing to our YouTube channel. You can also listen to SparX on Spotify, Apple Podcast, or any other audio platform of your choice. If you have any suggestions on who we should invite or what topics we need to cover, just let us know in the comments. We are always listening, looking for ways to improve, and keep getting better as we go along.